Hi guys, my name's Myles Byrne. I work at Groupon. There's a beer keg here, and this beer is called Arrogant Bastard, which is kind of inappropriate. I think probably most people who know me would describe me as a modest gentleman, but I had to work with what I had. So this has been a really good conference. There's been a lot of really interesting talks, a lot of like low-level technical talks about the future of front-end web development. And I want to kind of like pop the stack a bit and talk about just kind of like, instead of tactical details of front-end development, but more of some of the lessons I've learned, not from the cool talks today, but from the kind of past 10 years being a web developer. Because I think one of the sad things is we see, in this industry all the time, we're constantly seeing new JavaScript frameworks, CSS frameworks, HTML frameworks, front-end frameworks, back-end frameworks pop up. And after a while, you learn that you don't have to pay attention to 90% of them because they're just not going to be around next year or sometimes halfway through this year. So I kind of tend to try and focus my attention on the things that don't change rather than the things that do, because hopefully you'll get more mileage out of it. So that's kind of the topic of my talk for today, which I've called the way of the front-end developer. And I don't know if this is a bit cliched by now, but this is the Chinese and Japanese character for well, in Chinese, it's Dao or Tao, and in Chinese, I think it roughly translates, according to Wikipedia, to the way or the path, or the route. In Japanese, it's Do, and the rough translation there, which is similar, right, is a body of knowledge and a tradition with an ethic and an aesthetic. And I mean, the reason I'm putting this up is not because it looks cool. It does. But because there really isn't a good English translation. We don't really have this concept in English. But it exists in any kind of, in anything that becomes a craft. I feel like it certainly exists. And probably the closest thing we have is something like best practices, which is such a shitty term. It's just so horrible. And really not related to this concept of the way. And the Do in the Japanese one is like, when you hear like Aikido or Hapkido, the Do part is the second part of that word. And it's like usually a lot of these martial arts, I don't know a lot about martial arts, but part of the focus is not just on tactics, but on the way, how to live the judo way. And they often emphasize that it's not, the reason that best practices isn't a good translation for this is, it's often emphasized that all paths end up leading to the same destination. So it's not like you have to go this way or you will completely fail. And you don't even have to walk on the path. The idea behind following the way and walking on the path is the path has less friction, right? There's less crap on the path, right, that you're going to run into. So that's kind of the concept behind this. This was my working title, but then I thought about this. I don't know. Still working on it. Has anybody read this book? It is a very old, actually, no, it's about a very old thing, but the book itself isn't that old. I think it was 2003. But yeah, I mean, obviously I'm not the first to equate this concept of the way with software engineering. And Eric Raymond wrote this book, and this is about Unix programming, which these days we call back-end web development. I don't know why. In it, he has like these two foils, right? And this guy This guy is Master Fu, and this is his student, Newbie. And he has this parable about, like a kind of like Taoist type parable. That's a story about Master Fu and his student, Newbie. And I'm going to paraphrase it because, I don't have it written down perfectly here. But the story is like a programmer journeyman goes to visit Master Fu. And, he has tea with him, and they engage in a discussion. And Master Fu, while they're talking, says to him, he says, there is more of the Unix way in one line of shell script than there is in 10,000 lines of C. And this journeyman, he's a master C programmer. He's been programming in C for many years. And he says, how could that be? He says, the kernel itself was written in C. And Master Fu says, yes, that's true. But there's more of the way in one line of shell script than 10,000 lines of C. And the journeyman programmer is kind of like thinking that maybe this master's not all he's cracked up to be. Maybe he's kind of, as old masters tend to do, lost his mind a bit. An example of that is if you go to Eric Raymond's site now. But he says, C gives us these powerful techniques, the bitwise operators and pointer arithmetic. And it brings us close to the machine, brings us, so the programmer and the machine can become one and achieve amazing performance. And Master Fu says, yes, all that you said is true. But there's more of the way in one line of shell script than there is in 10,000 lines of C. And at this point, the journeyman's kind of exhausted. He gives up, and he's like, all right, I'm going to go. Because he probably figures his compile's done by now anyway. And Master Fu says, just nods at his student, Newbie, right? And Newbie goes up to the whiteboard, and he writes this shell script on the whiteboard. This is my favorite shell script, which is why I've used it here. And Master Fu says to the journeyman programmer, he says, look at that shell script. How long would it take you to write that in C? Is that not a 10,000 line C program? And this shell script actually fits on one line. I've broken it up just to make the text larger. And the journeyman looks at it for about 15 minutes. That's the average reading speed for shell script. It's about one line every 15 minutes. And eventually he nods his head and he says, yes, that would be 10,000 lines of C. And so Master Fu says, so who is the one who knows the way? The one who writes 10,000 lines of C, or the one who sees just the fruitlessness of the task and writes one line of shell script? And so then I guess what I want to ask, what I want to kind of explore in this talk is, that book was written in 2003 about an operating system that I think first came out in 1969. So it took a really long time for people to really kind of come to grips with what is the way of back-end programming. And still to this day, we're not really there yet. I mean, I can report to you, I do some back-end programming as well, and I can report to you there has been a massive improvement. We no longer write 10,000 line C programs to do what you can do in one line of shell script. We write 500-line Ruby and Python programs. So there has been progress, definitely. But the way is still not known amongst the back-end developers. So the question I want to ask is there a similar thing for front-end development? What got me thinking about this was a long time ago, in 2010, I moved to Chicago to work for a company there as a senior developer. And just as I joined, this company had an internal product that had been really successful, made them millions of dollars, and the management had decided, well, they wanted to take this internal product, Ruby on Rails program, really big Ruby on Rails program, because it made them so much money, they wanted to make it into a commercial, marketable product, a web app with an online subscription fee and stuff, and sell it to other similar companies in the industry and make hundreds of millions of dollars, right? There was already a team of a bunch of developers, and they had hired a few more, myself included. And we had an architect, which is always good. And And lo, the architect said, all right, for this new program, we will not fork the old internal tool. We will start afresh. And we will write the back end as a bunch of distributed services, service-oriented architecture. And then we will write the front end as a rich client. We will pick one of these fancy new JavaScript rich front end client toolkits, and we will write the front end for this in that. So I worked on this project for about a year. We had many problems on this project, and not all of them were related to the front-end technology, but I'm just going to talk about the ones that were related to the front-end technology. Now, you have to remember this was 2010, right? So, Ember didn't exist yet. We had to use this ancient tool called Sprout Core, right? The Sprout Core at the time, we got this through to management because we said, well, look at this fantastic tool. This is what Apple uses, and everybody loves Apple. And so they were like, well, that's fantastic. You must use what Apple uses, right? And so we did. And the first problem, the first time I felt like we were taking a step off the path and started to think about what the path was, right, was when we got the initial version of this app running and booted, the kind of earliest alpha. And the app didn't have any URLs. It was the first web app I had worked on that didn't have any URLs. I mean, it was a JavaScript app making all these JSON service calls under the hood and stuff. So those things had URLs. But when it loaded in the browser, it was just at the root URL. There were no other URLs. It was the first app I worked on where adding URLs was a to-do item. That was a story that we were going to get around to, right? It wasn't just like you're building a web app, there are URLs, because that's how this shit works. It was like, we're building this app, and then we're going to add URLs to it as a feature, because we would have had to use those hash bang URLs and bring a front-end router in. The other thing that kind of worried me was when we started working on the app, we used templates. There was this like templating language, and then I think the architect said, no, we don't use templates. We'll use view objects, right? And then I think we started using templates again. That was strange. I had just always done HTML templates on web apps. And then the thing that really the thing before the thing that really shook me was at one point we had this text field bug that this programmer had been working on for a week. Just a text, like a single text field input field that this guy couldn't work out, and he was about to have a nervous breakdown. So they switched him out and they assigned it to me, right? And I spent 2 weeks on this one text field because we had to connect the underlying store object with the model object, with the controller object, with the view object displaying it, and then synchronize that with the formatter object and the validator object. And you would have all these fucking pieces in the air, right? And you'd wire them all together, this binding and that binding, and this one only goes one way and whatever. You think you'd have it all set up, and you're like, sweet, all right, and it goes into user testing. And the guy like literally clicks one thing. He clicks one thing and he hits tab, right? And the little text field goes red and the entire browser locks up. Right? And of course, it didn't have any URLs, right? So your app's in some weird state. All you can do is refresh, and it goes back to the starting state. It's like using Windows 95, right? That was worrying. But I mean, the moment it really hit me, I can remember this. So you have to imagine, like at this point, we're 6 months in. The app still doesn't have any URLs. It's still a story, and our product owner shows us it'll get prioritized. And so let me set the scene for you. There are like 7 worn-out, 5 o'clock shadowed developers sitting around a table, looking really beaten down. It's a little conference room, right? And our product owner / product designer / I don't know, interaction designer or whatever the fuck they call themselves these days. He walks in smiling, right? I mean, you know the guy I'm talking about, right? He's like, he used to be a programmer, right? And now he's like, yeah, I used to be a programmer, but then I really realized that I was into the big picture. Because totally that makes sense. Who wants to look at tiny little pictures when you can look at big pictures, right? Why would you look at like a postcard when you can look at a mural, right? Where was I? Sorry. So fucking smiling product owner enters the room, right? And he puts down his MacBook and he plugs in the mini DisplayPort. And our user interface appears on the screen. All the developers stare up and look at it. And it's the same user interface, but one thing has changed. He's added a button. And by added a button, I mean crudely photoshopped it onto a screenshot of our user interface, right? He hasn't done any actual work. And this is the icon in the button, right? This is the point where I realized, like, this is the point where if we were on a journey, I turned around and realized we were so far from the path that I could not even see it. It had passed the horizon. We were so lost in the weeds. We were adding a refresh button to a web app, inside a browser that already has a refresh button. Because the primary interface for this app was like in the bottom left of the screen, because it was like simulating a desktop app, so it had all these other, you could slide things around, like adjust, make this part of the screen thinner and make this part of the screen thicker. None of this was state persistent. It all went away every time you refreshed. The bottom left, crammed in the bottom left, was where all the content that the users actually cared about was. And the problem we were having is 2 users would be using it, and because it wasn't like a web app, because it was this fancy Sprout Core app, the state would change between the two, right? And our product owner's genius solution was to add a refresh button. And I mean, that's really when I thought, okay, that's when I started thinking about what has gone wrong here, and is there something we fundamentally miss? Is there a way to programming, to web programming, to front-end development? Because this is not the way. And I mean, of course, our product owner, he said, hey guys, I know about like server push and back-end sync, and we're totally going to get onto that stuff. This is just a temporary solution. And there's like an old Russian proverb that I'm probably going to butcher, which is like, nothing is more permanent than a temporary structure. This thing, the project went on for another 6 months, and of course the refresh button never got removed. In fact, it was probably the most used thing in the app. Until it eventually got shit canned, right? Actually, I think we said, no, it was rebooted. No, it was pivoted. We pivoted, right? That's what happened. But this button haunted me, right? The fact that I had to work on a web app that we built a refresh button in haunted me. And like the only way I can describe it, getting back to that martial arts metaphor, it's like we had decided as a team to learn some new fancy martial art, and we had spent all our time working on this sweet like fly kick that, or like roundhouse that became a fly kick in the air or something, right? And if you came and you hung out with us at the bar afterwards and said, hey guys, what are you working on? We would be like so keen to tell you about this wicked martial art and these wicked moves we're executing. And then we might look down on the ground and mumble and be like, yeah, we haven't figured out how to land it yet, right? And then if any actual like martial artist came up to us, like a 12-year-old or something, they could just kick the crap out of us, right? Because it was ridiculous. I mean, the one thing I will say, and this, the Ember.js guy who spoke earlier, and who's probably glad he's not here right now, the one thing I will say that I learned, a concept I picked up from Sprout Core that I think is fantastic is state charts. And it's just a really good concept to think about state in a program. And there's a really good paper on it that they actually reference from the Sprout Core site. So if for no other reason, or I guess what is the Ember site now, go to the Ember site, download that paper. It's really awesome for building stateful user interfaces. So I mean, this was Master Fu's statement to the C programmer, and I guess what I want to think about is there a front end alternative? And I would just suggest to you, again, as I say, like I'm talking about the way, like I know what it is. I'm also on a journey. I'm just fumbling around. I don't really. But I would suggest to you, this is my framing of it, that there was more browser nature in one form tag than there is in 1,000 lines of JavaScript. And I mean, here's a couple of form tags, right? And when you think about it, it's pretty great what they do. It's pretty great. You put in a little bit of code there, right? And this form tag reads data out of a user input. First, it renders a user input, right, onto the screen, and then it sets up the behavior so that if you press enter inside that input, it'll submit the form. And to submit the form, that's a whole concept in itself. It reads the text out of the input of the form, and then it serializes that into a, albeit shitty serialization format, right? Like the actual URL strings are crappy, but ultimately they're key values, right, of strings. And then it transmits that over the network to a destination that you describe declaratively up the top. That's pretty cool. And if any of you guys have done like desktop programming, where like to do something like this, to read an input out and then send it over the network, you first have to set up like all your dependencies. You have to require all these different user interface libraries and all these different string libraries, and then you gotta have like a compiler and a linker, and you gotta build the whole thing, and you've got to like deal with like types, and just a bajillion things can go wrong, right? It's pretty rad that you can just write these tags and then have this action happen with very little code. And then the same goes here, right? It's just nice that this kind of tiny form tag says, all right, make this data structure, send it over the network to this location, post it to that guy. It's pretty cool. It can be so much worse than this. We have it good. And so then it got me thinking, and I'd like everybody to just look at this for a second while I have beer. It got me thinking, like, what is an example of code that would exemplify the way, such that it is, of web development? And so then I cooked this together. And what I like about this, a few things I like about this. I mean, everybody's written code like this at one point, right, in their career. And maybe that you did it in PHP or in Rails or whatever. This is a front-end conference with front-end developers. You've written a template like this to do something like this, right? And there's a couple of cool things about it. One, this code is two programming languages put together, which is always very dangerous. When you take two languages and put them together, it's not just twice the ways to fuck it up. It's more like 8 times the ways. Like you really make it much more difficult to see what's going on. So you have to be really careful when you put two languages together. And I think the guys who wrote Mustache did a very, very good job at this, right? And one thing you could say is for both languages, these are two languages together, both languages are declarative languages, are purely declarative languages. And so this code, right, is fed into a Mustache template rendering program that makes HTML based on the Mustache code here, and then that HTML code is fed into a browser and then rendered in the browser. Everybody knows that. Just as a side note, I gave a talk a while ago where I had some HTML on the screen, and I was talking about it like this, and I was calling it code. And this guy came up to me afterwards, and can everybody hear me all right? Yeah. I'm not actually sure if he had a luscious neck beard. This is just how I remember him in my mind. But he said, you kept calling your HTML code. It's not code, it's markup, right? And you kept saying that the thing it describes is a program, and it's not a program, it's a document, right? Now, as a programmer, I too am a stickler for words, and don't like seeing a word used in the wrong context, or a vague word used where a more precise word would do better. But I think in this particular case, the distinction doesn't mean much. Like the way I think about programming is you learn some vocabulary and some grammar, some esoteric thing cooked up by the author of the language. And then you learn enough of it to make the computer do what you want it to do. And if that's what you're doing, if you're writing some stuff in some language that's instructing the computer to do something you wanted it to do, that's programming, right? It doesn't matter if someone's calling it a config file or a markup file, or if you're typing it into a text area or a text editor or an IDE or whatever. If you're writing instructions to the machine to feed into some other program to get it to do what you want it to do, that's programming, right? And there's good ways to program and there are bad ways to program. But to kind of go, well, there's a difference between markup and programming, is a lot of BS to me. I think it's worth distinguishing between a declarative language and a non-declarative language, but distinguishing between a markup language and a true programming language is not worth much. And so one thing I want to like really emphasize here is this is two declarative languages blended very, very nicely together. And I want to like really just kind of go over what I mean with declarative here. This substitution here, right, the two mustaches and then some string, right, that's actually saying, that's implying, you know, you're only writing this, but you're implying, well, first look up the variable, and there's actually quite a complex lookup that goes on under the scenes, find the last search query variable, and then if it's not null, read it out, HTML, escape it, and then substitute it for this mustache enclosed term. Otherwise, just put an empty string there, right? And there was a time, I've used templating languages, you probably all have as well, where it wasn't as nice, where you would end up jamming this logic in there, right? Because you would get like undefined or null literally in the actual rendered output, right? Or it wouldn't be HTML escape properly. So, you know, this looks like nothing, but that's the beauty of it, that it looks like nothing, right? That's a great thing. You know, a really good declarative language hides the underlying logic, kind of like SQL does. And the same thing's going on here, right? On the HTML side, not on the mustache side, right? This is a relatively new attribute. I believe it came in HTML5. And has anybody ever written like input fields with the placeholder text before this attribute came in? Yeah? Yeah? Because, you know, people see them in desktop apps and they're like, I want it to work that way, right? And, you know, it's quite a bit of code. I've written it. This is actually simplified logic, right? This is pseudocode. It probably wouldn't even work. Probably need more code than this, right? But, you know, you just write placeholder equals whatever, and then under the scenes, the browser implementation of this says, well, you know, when I'm inserting this element into the DOM, I need to check if there's a value there, and if there's a value there, just literally display that. And if there isn't, display the placeholder text, but, you know, display it with a different style. And then anytime someone focuses on it after they blur it, just basically run that process again. But it's pretty sweet that you don't even have to think about that. And then this one as well. This one is awesome. So, you know, you pass into your mustache program either a data structure or an object that has a books array on it, or a books method that returns an array. And mustache is going, can I find books? Does that even exist, right? Is that not null, right? And then if it's not null, is it an array? And if it's an array, then open that array and then render this block inside in the context of the object that comes out of that array, which is pretty awesome. It's pretty awesome that that's all encapsulated in this really nice syntax. So, you know, there's looping, there's null checking, there's HTML escaping. It's all awesome, and you don't even have to think about it. You know, I have to mention this. There's been a few mentions of handlebars today, and I believe Groupon uses handlebars as their mustache implementation. I do not consider handlebars a mustache implementation. Handlebars is kind of like mustache's retarded stepbrother, right? It's like mustache's mom had a one-night stand with an over-engineer, right? And handlebars was the result, right? The whole point of mustache is logicless templating, right? And so the mustache guys took that and then put each in there. They put if in there, right? They put the logic right back in there. They were like, we made it better. Check it out. I don't know. I don't even know like how you even, I don't know. It boggles my mind. So anyway, that's, I don't know. I hope I've come some way towards making a case that sometimes you get so used to the power of the underlying platform that you kind of forget it's there. And you forget how much is being done for you, and you kind of get bored. And you're like, I need to do some like wicked cool things like all my iPhone developer friends are doing, right? And everything, it's so easy for me on the front end. And you can get yourself into a bit of a mess. You can end up being the C programmer that's like 800 lines into his 10,000 line C program that can be written with a, you know, rewritten in a one-line shell script. And at that point, you really don't want to listen to the guy that comes up to you and goes, hey dude, you could do this in one line of shell, right? You're going to come up with a lot of clever reasons why you can't do it in one line of shell. You know, I hear a lot of those. And then, you know, we're JavaScript developers as well. So I want to talk, just want to go through a couple of examples of using JavaScript in a way that I think exemplifies the way as I see it, the DOE. And here's one example. How many people have done this, right? You know, you have like use the HTML5 time element, and then you could embed a timestamp as an attribute. But then in your actual user interface, you want it to display time in words. So you want to say this thing was posted 3 hours ago, right, or whatever. I think that's really nice. It's, you know, using the data attribute, it's really declarative. Just saying, okay, it's really easy for the person writing the markup to type that in and know what to expect to happen. And then it's really easy to implement it on the JavaScript side, right? And you want to do this with the data attribute and not classes. If you do it with classes, you're complecting the problem that the designer is trying to solve, which is trying to get a handle on it to put some CSS on it, and the problem the JavaScript developer is trying to solve, which is trying to get a handle on it to modify the DOM structure, right? They both need a handle on it, but if they share the same handle, you're just going to break one of their code. So it's really nice to use the data attribute for things you want to annotate with JavaScript. So like native elements you want to take and make better. It's a really good idea to use the data attribute there to get access to them. And yeah, these are just a couple of examples. So these are like elements that the browser already implements, but I want to tweak them a bit. So I want to tweak the time element to show time in words. And I want to tweak the input element to only accept bridge scores, right? So I'm going to write some JavaScript that validates that and make sure that happens. And hopefully not lose my mind. But it's easier when you don't have to bring in the Sprout Core framework to do it. And then here's another example. This is the other thing that's really common, which is, all right, so there isn't a native element to do what you want to do, right? So you've got some app you want to design, and you need some widget, and it's like half a drop-down, half a search field, half a multi-select. You know, like the in Gmail, the thing that allows you to tag your emails, right? It's this hybrid new element, and it's awesome, right? And so you've got some awesome product developer that wants you to build one of those. And in that case, you could do something like this. You could say, all right, well, it's going to need I'm going to need some basic HTML structure that I'm going to reuse every time I use this element. So you could do something like this. You could use a script tag, jam the basic HTML template stuff in there, and it won't be rendered into the browser, but you can still get access to the text inside it later. And then at the actual point in the DOM where you want to put it, you could use another script tag, use a different data attribute. So up here we're saying, here's where I'm going to define the template. You only need to define the template once. And then over here you're saying, here's a tag where I want an instance of it. You can have like as many of these as you like, right? And then inside that, you could put the JSON, you could just put a JSON blob referring to the data you'll need to render this particular instance, right? I mean, an alternative here is to render this HTML template with the stuff you need on the server, which is fine. But if it really is like a widget, a client-side widget you're building, which, by the way, I think is the right and proper use of JavaScript, right? Re-emulating MVC on the client Sprout Core style, I'm skeptical about that whole approach, right? But building like cool new widgets like that Gmail thing, you can only do it in JavaScript. And it's awesome, right? We use those things all the time. They've proven themselves as valid uses of JavaScript. So this is just like the way I like to do it when implementing these. Again, trying to keep it declarative, right? Trying to keep the code in my template just declarative. And then finally, in your actual JavaScript, so in this case, I actually like using the backbone views. I think the backbone view class is really awesome. And internally, the backbone view class can encapsulate a model class, just as long as you don't expose it. And so you could just say, hey, find me all the data view instances, and then find me the class. And if there's no class, we'll just put a guard clause here, so just leave this function, right? So if you haven't yet implemented the class, you don't get a console error or anything, which is nice. And then you say, okay, cool. If somewhere in my concatenated JavaScript for the application, I have a class called widget, right? Then let's go ahead and see if we can find in the DOM the template for this class. And then if we can find that, let's go ahead and instantiate it, right? And once you have access to this element, then you can read the internal JSON out of it, right? Parse that, and then build up your element, right? Fill in all the tags for the Gmail tag searcher or whatever. And to me, there's a million ways to do this, right? You could do this, a common way to do this is to not use a script tag, is to use a div, is to put more of the HTML inline in there, but have it all blank, right? And just repeat it over and over again in the document. And then to use some call like this, but then make a call to the server to pull the content back. But I don't know. If it really is, it's going to be faster if you just render the JSON into the document where you need it. But you don't need to render JavaScript code. You can just render the actual JSON data structure and then get access to it. And then I want to talk about a couple of slightly more advanced techniques. Taking the Groupon side as an example. So this is not the new Groupon. By the way, dudes, there's a bug here. See, those two tabs are highlighted. I didn't do anything, unless that's a feature. So this is this widget that appears when you click on this arrow here, right? And you click on that arrow, and it's, what's it called, the division selector or something, right? It's about, I don't know, I think it's about 1,000 lines of HTML, and it gets rendered in with the document that comes down, right? But the thing is, I don't know what the stats are. I don't know how many times people actually click on this, right? So one optimization you could make, so if you're writing an app like this, and you're trying to follow the HTML way, front-end way, so to speak, and it's not super like you're not spending all day dealing with bindings, and you can kind of think a bit high level here. Is there a way to just get rid of this thing or not render all this HTML time and time again if you're not going to use it? Or if you're not going to use it 90% of the time. And one of the ways to think about this, I kind of call this like the converting a fragment of the page into an asset pattern. It's the best name I've come up with for it. So you could have like a div tag that has the Modesto heading 2 in it, right? And then as a data attribute actually has a URL where to get the HTML that should go in there, and there's also a data view instance, so it gets booted up by a view class when the page loads. And you could say, in that class, you could say, once the page is loaded, go and get me this guy. And if you fingerprint that guy properly, so you actually get all the, say this is pulling records from a division table, right? You find the most recently modified division in that table, and you get that updated at field, and then you concatenate that to the modification time of the partial used to render this thing, and then you hash that, and then that's the fingerprint for the thing, and you put that in there, and then you can take advantage of the browser's least recently used cache, right? So this is like it's going to be treated like as if it was an image now. And so as the user's clicking around the Groupon page, you've only ever loaded it once. And then when a user actually clicks on that down arrow, you could actually capture the click event and go ahead and render it. So you've just pulled 1,000 lines of code out of your page, and no one's going to notice. Simplifying, I really like that kind of optimization because, I'll come back to that. It simplifies the back-end code. The back-end code doesn't have to render as much HTML, which means less HTML goes down the wire, right? Which means the front end, the browser, has to read less HTML, so the parse finishes faster. It's optimized in a few places, and it's not that difficult to do. The trickier case is when you have something like this. This is the personalization sidebar. I don't know how many people are familiar with this, but this is custom. This is a piece of the website. It sits on the right, down the side, and it's custom to you specifically. It's tailored to you. Now, in this case, in the previous case, that element was hidden. It only ever appeared when you clicked that button to expand it, right? So you could do all that, fetch it in the background. If it was already in the cache, it'd be fetched straight away, and everything would look fine. In this case, if you haven't fetched this thing yet, you have to show a spinner, right? So the thing's coming in, you have to show a spinner. That's fine. For the first time, you have to show a spinner. What you could do is, if you're going to render this on every page load, what you could do is, after you've pulled it down, first time the user's visited your page, you've pulled down this fragment, you've inserted it into the DOM, you can stash it in local storage. And in this case, I've just said, I had a function called write cached HTML, so that would use the browser's local storage. So you've just pulled it down, you haven't done any transforms or anything to it, you stash it in the local storage, which will persist across page reloads, right? And then you go ahead and render it. And then you go ahead, actually you probably want to pass response HTML to this render guy as well, so he knows what to do. And then you go ahead and you actually, no, the code is right. And then in the render function, you read from the cache. So you wrote to the cache, and then in the render function, you read that HTML out. You put it onto the page, you attach, you do any things you need to do to it, right? And then when the user visits another page, this view is going to boot up again. It's immediately going to use what's in the cache, right? But it's still going to go and get me the latest version, and then it's going to swap the new version in. So you don't even need to draw a spinner here. And I mean, obviously it's a trade-off. Like maybe for some reason you want your users to say, hey, I'm loading some new thing for you. But I think that can be quite disconcerting, right? To have an application that's got all these spinners everywhere. I mean, especially if, like, I don't know what the stats are on this, but I refreshed this page like 5 times last night, and I got the same personalized thing every time. So especially if it's not going to change, right? If you know for a fact it's not going to change that much, render the old one in, and your site just looks twice as fast. This thing could take 5 seconds to load, and no one's going to know. Also, you know, things that take 5 seconds to load shouldn't hold up the rendering of the entire page. I'm suspicious of the rendering process of the Groupon page, because something seems to hold it up. And then finally, and this one I've just started to use, and this one I think is a really cool hack, but I'm still working on it. I'm still not ready to release it into the wild. So the idea behind this is you need back-end support for this. You have a web app that has no AJAX, right? Every time, it's old school. Every time you click on a link, the new page loads. Every time you submit a form, and you get redirected back, and the user interface loads. So you take that page, and then you go and you put a click handler on every link, and you say, capture all clicks that go to links, and when a user clicks on them, annotate that. So don't do a normal request, do an AJAX request, and include this header. Include xbups, B-U-P-S, right? So include that header. Now, if the server responds to you and says, oh yeah, I also know, if the response also includes the header xbups, i.e. you've discovered server support, and if you're writing this app yourself, you have to implement both ends of this, then instead of the server response being the full HTML, you can have the server say, only send me back the body tag, and only send me back the title, right? And that's why I call this BOPS. It's body update push state. So only send me back the body tag, only send me back the title, and then you just replace out the entire body tag with this new body tag. You change the document title. You push state, so you change the URL to the new URL. If for any reason the response you got back wasn't xbups, you fail over and just do a normal page reload, right? And then the only other thing you got to do is you got to call, by the way, this is CoffeeScript. I guess you guys figured that out though. You got to call bops rendered from your actual HTML body. You have to put that script tag in your HTML body. And every time you care about, did the page just reload, right? If you have any of those handlers you have to put on to show like time in words or whatever, right? You need to trigger on that event. And anyway, you do this. I've implemented this for an app, and it's remarkable. So this app has no custom, your standard kind of custom AJAX code where you capture a click event on some specific thing and you swap out part of the page, or you just toggle one thing or whatever. So you have to write all this custom code to do a partial update. I've got an app that has no custom code for doing partial updates. The server only knows how to render whole pages, but it has this after filter that knows how to see that it's an xbups response, and it takes the HTML and just chops off the head, right? Parses out the title, sends it back as JSON, and then the client parses it, swaps out the body, and it feels like an AJAX app. Like you can't tell the difference. The actual render time of the entire body is so fast, it's like 20 milliseconds, that the difference between doing a clever partial update and redrawing the entire screen, you cannot tell the difference. And it also, the browser keeps your scroll point, so the browser doesn't move around or anything. And I like that, because I feel like that's, I don't know, in the spirit of web programming, to try and come up with a small amount of script to put in just the right spot to get a really big gain out of it without burying yourself in thousands of lines of JavaScript. It's not perfect. I'm still working out some issues with, so obviously if you click the back and forth button, you need to capture the pop state, and you need to call BOPS again and figure out how to move between screens. It also won't work if your header differs between different pages on your in your application, which isn't common, but is something people do. There's a couple of other corner cases where it won't work. I've got an app where it works fine, but there are definitely ways. You can't just drop this into any application and immediately get this performance boost out of it. And then one other nice thing you could do, you could add a callback to this guy. So re-render, so go ahead, get the new HTML, swap the body in, and then call this function. So you could do things like if you're moving between one page or another, flash the element on the next page you're moving to kind of say you moved here, or do an effect transition to make it look even more like this is some clever JavaScript Ajax code, when really it's just like a very crude swapping in of the whole page and then triggering a small amount of Ajax afterwards. So those are the examples I have. Talked a bit fast, but I'm still almost out of time, so I'm just going to go really quickly through. After I wrote this talk, last night I finished up all these slides, and I was thinking, what this does, it feels like the way to me. Are there those tags I wrote earlier that look like custom HTML elements? Is anybody working on making it so that we can write JavaScript in such a way where basically all we're doing is defining new HTML elements? So it's like, sweet browsers, you shipped us all these really cool HTML elements. They have really cool features like that placeholder thing. We use them all the time. You've made our job really easy. It's really awesome. But there's a few elements you're missing, and we'd like to write them. Because right now, like, the HTML widgets we write are kind of second-class citizens. There's a big difference between them and the native tags. And is there a way, are they working on bridging that gap? And it turns out that they are. And W3C is, which is pretty cool. Like, I don't know, if you've been working on the web for a few years, you learn not to expect a lot out of this organization. But this is awesome. And there's a few components in here. There's something called the shadow DOM, something called decorators, something called templates, which are like that script tag except official. And then finally, using the shadow DOM, decorators, and templates allow you to implement custom elements. And the cool thing, has anybody heard about the shadow DOM? It's pretty rad. So the shadow DOM already exists now. Like, when you look at a HTML5 video element, right? So that element pops up on the screen. You know the controls down the bottom, the play, pause, and the slider and stuff, right? They are rendered in HTML, but if you view source or you right-click and inspect, they're not actually in the DOM, right? And that's because they're in the shadow DOM. So modern browsers are using the DOM, which is like the stuff you rendered, and then the stuff they rendered in the background. And then the idea here is you're going to be able to access the shadow DOM and use it to make elements that you're basically using to make new types of HTML elements, like the video tag. So they're going to kind of standardize that, which is going to be pretty awesome. This thing, that's a terrible rendering of the website, but it's not that great a site. This is by the guys at Mozilla, and they kind of took that specification and said, can we do it now? And you kind of can. It's not very good. It's a bit janky, but it's like a proof of concept that you can write custom tags now. They're using they're prefacing every tag with X. So they have like a custom accordion tag, and it's X accordion. And it's just like raw HTML, no data attributes, nothing like that, just these custom tags. You put them in the DOM, and they get annotated with all the JavaScript, and they render like custom elements. And they work if you insert them via inner HTML. They work when you render them first. They work if you do document create element. Doesn't matter how you make these fancy elements. They end up getting annotated with all the JavaScript. So that's all I've got on the front end way. There's just one more thing I wanted to mention. Two more things actually. This beer is really good. There's it's kind of a bit of a dick move to drink a beer in front of it. I'll keep that in mind for my next talk. There's a subtle distinction I want to make between the wise Unix programmer who knows how to write the program in 10,000 lines of C to do that shell script, but uses the shell script anyway. And I think that's what Eric Raymond was trying to get through in that parable. And it's tricky. Is there are two kinds of people that could use that shell script. One who has no idea what it's doing, but it's much easier to manipulate, to copy and paste, and to pretend you know what's going on in like a 6-segment shell pipeline than it is in a 10,000 line C program, where you have to admit, I have no idea what the fuck's going on here, right? And this, so really understanding the browser's rendering model, really trying to get in with the way of the web programming model, and then do the minimum amount of work, you make the minimum amount of effort, is different from just saying, I want to do the minimum amount of work, right? I need to make this thing, and I need to make it quickly, so I'm going to combine this library with this Ruby gem, and I'm going to, just munge all these things together, right? And it's all going to work really fast. Check it out. It's like I'm shell scripting, right? And it's not. It's like you're kiddie scripting, right? And it's dangerous. So there's a difference between understanding what needs to be done and then doing the minimum, and really having no understanding what's being done and doing the minimum because it's all you can do. It's a subtle distinction, but I think it's lost commonly. And then finally, this is one of my favorite quotes of all time. By a guy called Miyamoto Musashi, who was he was a philosopher and obviously sword fighter. He was a samurai. And he says, I'll read it out to you. The primary thing when you take a sword in your hands is your intention to cut the enemy, whatever the means. When you parry, hit, spring, strike, or touch the enemy's cutting sword, you must cut the enemy in the same movement. It is essential to attain this. If you think only of hitting, springing, striking, or touching the enemy, you will not actually be able to cut it. And I think of this quote every single day when I'm programming. What am I doing now to cut the enemy? Because it's really, really easy to get lost in what am I doing now that is interesting. Like, oh my God, I just downloaded this new technology and it has this really new build tool that I haven't heard of, and I'm going to need to configure it all right. Every time I find myself doing that, oh, this is a cool templating language, but I should extend it with these 3 ideas I had. I'm like, stop, right? Is this a cut to the enemy, right? Am I moving in my original direction? This is my like anti-over-engineering mantra. And I'm by no means perfect. I, like any programmer, over-engineer the shit out of features all the time and throw away 2 days of code because I realize it's garbage. But this is kind of like what I try and always keep in mind to avoid falling into that tar pit. That's what I got. Thanks, guys. I'm kind of over. Do you want me to take questions? All right, I'd love to. Yes, sir. Yep. No, because it does use Ajax, right? It's just that Ajax is a few optimizations put together, right? Ajax is making a request without locking the entire page, right? It's making an asynchronous request. And it's also then being able to say, oh, that asynchronous request finished. I still have access to the DOM, and I could do some manipulation. So often the reason people do partial manipulation on an Ajax request is because it's easier to just partially manipulate the page than it is to manipulate the whole page, right? Unless you get the whole page's content back, right? If you think about like implementing an upvote button, right, on like Hacker News or Reddit or something, right? And you want to implement that in Ajax. Because if you don't implement that in Ajax, you click one button, right? You redraw the entire page so that one tiny number goes from 4 to 5, right? So you implement that in Ajax, and all of a sudden it's like 1,000 times faster, right? That's a partial page update. Oh, okay. So what I'm saying is, so yes, I'll make that more clear. The reason you did the partial page update if you're implementing Hacker News, say, right, is because you know the thing finished, you know the thing you wanted to update, and you didn't want to write a lot of code, so you just wrote code to just update this one number, right? What I'm saying is the way BUPS is implemented, it's implemented in such a way that it's the same amount of code to say, hey, redraw the whole page, right? And then you redraw the whole page, and practically you're not going to notice the difference between and when I say redraw the whole page, I mean redraw the body element. What you notice moving between pages is the fact that the whole rendering context gets flushed, and you often see a white flash, right? And then the new page renders in, right? And that's what the optimization bubs is. It avoids that. It says, I'm just going to keep rendering the body over and over. Absolutely, absolutely. It's going to be tricky to remember whether you're inside the shadow DOM or whether you're not inside the shadow DOM. Yeah. Like for example, that placeholder element I was saying, the gray text inside of the text field when you've blurred it and there is no content inside, that gray text is in the shadow DOM. It's not in the actual DOM. And you can tell that one way you can tell it's in the shadow DOM when you go to style it with CSS, and it is stylable. To get to the shadow DOM, you use pseudo selectors. So you use those two semicolons and then a dash, and that's like saying I'm breaking out of the primary DOM and I'm going one level into it, and it's like Inception, right? And then eventually we'll have a shadow DOM, and it'll get. I'm excited. Any other questions? Yeah, agreed. All right, guys, thank you so much for putting up with me.